Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Avenema Rafinogo and this is Code with Maro. Today we're going to be looking at how to use for loops and if statements in Dart with a simple login flow example. So we're trying to mimic how users are logged in into various websites or applications when they already have an account, and how a user who does not have an account is not allowed to log in. So for starters, I already created a list of users, so we'll move a lot faster. So the list of users contains 3 users, right? And we have the username, the password, and the email address. So what we're going to do now is we're going to enter the user's email address, or we're going to use the user's username to log in. Now we could decide to use the user's email or the username, whichever we want to use. So first we're going to try out using the username to log in. Before we do that, I'll just run through a simple for loop. Now, we're using a for in loop, right? So for every variable, this is the user. Now remember that a variable can be a map, can be a string, can be a dynamic or an integer. So this variable now will be a map. So this is going to say for every user in users, right? So we're looking at the users list and we're saying if there is an object in the users list. Now this object now is going to be a map of strings to dynamic. You see, it already assumes the data type that we have here. So we have a list of map, string to dynamic. Now this already assumes that. You see, before we added this other part to the code, this was actually a map. Was just showing a type of dynamic. So now we're saying for every user that exists in the list of users, we want to print the user's email address. So now this is us trying to get every single user on our list, right? So we print out the user's email address, right? So we print out the email. Well, this has to be a string. We print out the email of the user, right? Okay, there. So when we run this, we're going to print out all the email addresses we have, right? So after this, we're going to move on to the login flow. So we'll have Dart play.dart. There. So you see all the email addresses we have. We have maro@gmail.com, mary@gmail.com, and james@gmail.com. Now we're going to move on to the login flow, right? For us to be able to log in, we need that.io. I already imported that.io. Now we'll be asking the user to enter their username. So we'll have the standard output dot write line. Now this will ask the user to enter the username. So we'll say please enter your username, right? Now maybe later on we're going to test out and logging in with either username or password, but for now let's log in with just the username. So please enter your username, and when the user enters the username, we're going to put the response we get into, let's call this entered username, and this will be a standard input dot read line sync. There we go. And then when we read that line, we'll get the entered username. Now we're also going to ask the user to enter their password. Standard output dot write line. Please enter your password. Then we also, sorry, that was a mistake. We'll also read this out as the entered password. This would be the standard input dot read line sync. So this here, when we print this out, the user enters the username. This is going to be taken in, right? And when he enters the password, we'll take this. Now what we're going to do is we're going to check if this user actually exists. Now if entered username is same as the username, and the entered password is the same as the user's password, we're going to print user exists, right? There. So when we run this, first thing to do is ask us to enter a username and then also enter a password. So we're going to enter the username. We can see now James is the username, and then the password will be apples, and it says user exists. Now you see that it checks the user's username and it tells us the user exists because we have just the if statement written, right? Now, if we add an else statement, you're going to see why this has a little bit of a problem. So else print user not found. Now, if we run this, you'd see it's going to tell us we'll enter our username and password like we did the last time. So enter James again, James, and apples. Apples is James' password. So you see, it tells us because of the fact that it's looping through every element, every object or map in this list, it has to check every single one here, right? And it checks to see, oh, this does not have it, this has it. So it is also going to print out a response for each one of these, right? So that's the first issue we're having here now. So how do we combat that? Because imagine you're trying to log in and it's telling you you do not exist like 10 times before it tells you, oh yeah, we actually found your account. Sorry. You probably think there's something wrong with the system, right? So to solve that, we're going to add an else if here. So else if username, so entered username, yes, entered username is the same as the user's username, the same as user's username, but the password is different. The password is different, so entered password is not the same as the user's password. Then we'll say, sorry, password seems to be incorrect, right? That's quite long, so let's say, sorry, just print out incorrect password. Now we have this, right? And then if we run now, we would see that this would actually only still check and give us ones, right? Because we already have the user somewhere. Now, it is still going to look through everything, but it will not print out a response unless any of these conditions are met. So let's add a final statement, right? For a user who does not exist at all. So else another else if, please. Else if entered username, or sorry, let's use the whole users list now, right? So if the users dot to string, so we're going to convert the users list to a string and check if it contains the user's username. So if it contains entered username, right? Now this has to be, because of null safety, we need to add this here so we ensure that a value is actually being used to make this check. So we'll come back here and we'll add it here too. This tells us that this does not contain this, right? So we then print user not found. And when you save this and we run again, it tells us to enter username. So now we're going to enter, okay, let's try again with James and Apples first to ensure that what we tried to solve the first time does not repeat itself. So it tells you once now that user exists. The reason why is that it checks to see the first, it checks through the first user here. The name does not correspond. It does not correspond to the password or anything, and it goes to the next one. It checks. Now, because of the fact that there's no condition to check if and say if the name does not exist in this map printed, it moves on to the next until it finds what it's looking for, right? So the system will tell you you do not exist until it gets to your name. It keeps checking until it gets to your name, and if it checks through the whole thing and you still do not exist, that is where this is going to be executed. So we're going to try with that now. We're going to run this again, and then we're going to try with a user who does not exist, right? So we're going to try with, let's say, John, right? So we have John, and John thinks his password is one QWERTY, and he goes and he says, user not found, user not found, user not found. Oh, this was supposed to print out to us just once. Let's check why that happened. Okay, yeah, so why that happened, why this last statement still checks all three is because of what happened the first time, right? So it's still going to look through the first, second, and third. Now, the reason why, now we converted this to a list at once, right? But we're still in a for loop. So the loop will still check to see if, okay, we've converted this user to a string and checked it does not contain the entered username. Then let's go again, right? So because there's still another user. So it's going to loop how many times we have users. So what we're going to do now is when we're done with this, once we've checked to see that the user does not exist in the entire list of users, we're going to break out of the loop. Okay, and when we break out of the loop, we're going to run the check just once. So we'll run that again now and see. We used John earlier, right? So let's use John again. John and QWERTY, and we go. User not found. Now it prints user not found just once for us. Now there's something else I would like us to try before we call it quits today. You see that we're taking a map of strings and dynamic variables. We have an integer here and an integer here, right? And then strings here. Now let's try running and entering the integer as a password and see if we're going to get an error or not. And then we'll see how we'll fix it. So we have Mary, and then we have 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, and then when you run this, it says incorrect password. Now, oh yes, Mary exists, right? And the password is, oh, we got the password wrong. We got the password wrong. So let's try that again. Yes. Okay, so we have, let's run Maro now. Maro, and then we have the password. The password is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then we go, and it says incorrect password. Now, if you go up to Maro and you see that the password is actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now, why is this giving us an issue? Now, the reason now is we're trying to check an integer to against a string, right? So it will always throw a problem. So what we'll do here is come over here. So the entered password, we're going to turn, you see that entered password has to be a string, so it's taking in a string. But if you check the user password, it's almost certainly here, okay, we have a string here, but this is an integer, right? So that's two different types, and they can be checked against one another. So we will either convert this to an integer or convert this to a string, but it will be safer for us to convert the user's entered password to a string. So we'll do dot to string for this and this. And then if we run again, we're going to see that the same details we entered earlier will tell us that a user actually exists, right? So we have Maro, and then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then we go, and it says user exists. Now that is because we changed the integer in the list to a string, and then this. Now the reason why this had an issue earlier is because for that write line and read line sync, we can only take strings, right? So we were trying to pass in an integer when we needed a string, so it was having issues with the type conversions, and that was why it didn't work. So we used this to convert the integer to a string so we could run it. So this is basically how to run a basic login flow using a for in loop in Dart. Okay, so I did mention that we're going to try to see how we could log in with either the username or password or email address. So we're going to add that part to this now, right? So we're going to take in whatever the user enters, right? So we're going to rename this from entered username and change it to entered. Let's just call it entered text, right? Because it could be, right now we're going to ask for either the username or your password. So enter your password, your email, or username, right? So we're going to check with either the username or the email. So now, first thing we're going to check is if the entered text is same as the user's username, right? Or it is the same as the user's password, email address, then we can log in, right? But if it's not, then we do not log in. So we're going to bring this over to the other side too. Enter text, okay, or it is equal to the username. So now if enter text exists, yes, so that this checks out already. So now what we're trying to do now is we're going to check if the enter text is the same as the user's username or it is the same as the user's email address. Now whichever one the user supplies, we can then log in with. Let's clear this first, and then we can start all over. So we run. Now it tells us to enter our email or username. So let's use James at gmail.com, right? And then we'll have the password, which is apples. Now you see it tells us user exists. So we can choose to log in with the username or the password. Whatever we choose, we can would work, right? So we'll do this now and run. This time I want to use James' username and not his password, right? So we'll have James, and then we're going to have his password, which is apples. And you see, it tells us the same thing, user exists. So what you do is you check if the user has a username and an email that exists in our database. This now is acting as a database, right? And then we'll be able to run through. Thank you very much for staying tuned to the end. If you enjoyed the video, please do like, subscribe, and share. See you in the next video.